Hey guys, tonight we will tear open the veil of mystery surrounding Queen Elizabeth I. Forget those dry history lessons about a great woman who sacrificed herself for her country. Because the truth is not romantic at all. The truth is that she was not a virgin queen out of love, but out of profound terror. She chose a solitary life not out of patriotism, but for a simple and far more brutal reason. She was too frightened of men. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Today, we will explore the 5 horrors that shaped an autocratic, cold, and tragic monarch. From witnessing her mother's execution by her own father, to being abused by her stepfather right in her own chamber, and the physical secrets she hid beneath layers of poisonous makeup. Everything you think you know about Elizabeth I will change. This is not the story of a great queen, but a psychological case study of how a childhood wound can shape the fate of an entire kingdom. Before we begin, comment below to let me know where you are and what your local time island. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You think you know Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and ruled England for 45 years. Well, the real reason Elizabeth refused to marry is far more disturbing than any romantic movie dares to tell. She did not choose a solitary life because she loved her country more than any man. Behind that refusal lay a deep, psychological wound, born of a childhood filled with horror. By the time she was only 3 years old, Elizabeth had already witnessed her father, King Henry VIII, destroy her mother's life in the most brutal way imaginable. She saw Anne Boleyn stripped of her royal dignity, marched through silent corridors, and led to the scaffold where the blade fell. For a child, the message was terrifyingly clear. Marriage to the king could only end in tragedy, execution, exile, or worse. And young Elizabeth was not spared the cruelty of politics. After her mother's execution, her father forced her to stand before courtiers and publicly denounce the woman who had given her life, calling her a traitor and a shameful cast-off. That moment was not mere ceremonial cruelty. It was psychological warfare against an innocent child. Elizabeth never forgot. Hidden from prying eyes, she carried a small locket ring containing a portrait of her mother, a private act of devotion that she wore close to her heart for life. Modern psychologists believe that this constant reminder of her mother's violent end imprinted upon her a form of post-traumatic stress around the very idea of marriage. Each time she caught her reflection or felt the weight of her royal gowns, she sensed that marriage carried fatal consequences. When she turned 8, Elizabeth witnessed another ghastly spectacle. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, being dragged from the palace to face the executioner's block. The promise of romance had once again been twisted into a promise of death. By the time Elizabeth reached her 10th birthday, she had seen more horrors of marriage than most adults would see in a lifetime. Each new queen brought hope, only to be consumed by betrayal and blood. These lessons sank deep into Elizabeth's young mind. Marriage was not a tender bed of roses, but a battlefield strewn with broken bodies and shattered hearts. It meant surrendering one's fate to a man whose love could be as fleeting as it was lethal. And surrender, Elizabeth learned, meant destruction. When her father later tried to arrange her own marriage for political gain, Elizabeth knew exactly what that bargain would cost her. She remembered her mother's flowing gowns stained with tears, the cruel blade flashing under a cold sky, and the solemn voice that had forced her to betray her own blood. She recalled Catherine's fearful eyes as she stepped toward the executioner, and the hush of the crowd that seemed to swallow her whole. These memories became a litany of terror, each one a warning that marriage equaled mortality. So Elizabeth chose solitude, not out of lofty devotion to her realm, but out of a desperate will to survive. She wrapped herself in the mantle of virginity, knowing that no husband could ever share her bed without uncovering the skeletons in her closet. Better to rule alone than risk the same horrors she had witnessed as a child. And so the Virgin Queen was forged in fire and fear. Her refusal to marry was not an act of noble self-sacrifice, but an instinctive shield against the darkness she had known too well. In choosing a lonely crown, Elizabeth chose life itself at the cost of love, companionship, and the fragile hope of a peaceful union. Yet from that choice emerged a reign of strength and mystery, forever shaped by the terrifying lessons of a child who watched the world turn bloody before her eyes. Reason 1. Her father haunted her with the horrors of marriage. You might think that a child's first memories are of laughter and play, but for Elizabeth I, her earliest recollections were drenched in blood and betrayal. From the tender age of 3, her world was already eclipsed by the horrifying example set by her own father, Henry VIII. He, the king whose duty was to protect his daughter, instead sowed in her a terror of matrimony so profound that no promise of love or alliance could ever overcome it. Imagine a little girl barely out of infancy, watching as her mother, Queen Anne Boleyn, was torn from the life she had known. Anne Elizabeth's mother once walked the corridors of power in robes of emerald and pearls, her laughter echoing through halls that now reeked of fear. One day, that laughter ended. The command was given, and the Queen was accused of treason, stripped of her crown, and led in chains to the scaffold. From Elizabeth's vantage point, hidden perhaps behind a heavy tapestry or tucked into a corner of the gallery, she saw the blade descend with a finality that no bedtime story could ever erase. In that instant, her innocent mind learned that marriage to the king carried only 3 fates: death in childbirth, the fall of the executioner's axe, or a life of banishment and disgrace. But the horror did not end with the drop of Anne's head. In a display of cruelty that can only be called psychological warfare, Henry forced his 3-year-old daughter to stand before a hushed assembly of courtiers and denounce the woman who had given her life. Elizabeth's small, trembling voice had to pronounce her mother a traitor, a shameful woman, unworthy of her title. That command was not mere policy, it was an assault on the psyche of a child, an order to betray the deepest bond she possessed. And even as the crowd dispersed, leaving only whispers and the stink of blood, Elizabeth bore the weight of that betrayal in her heart. In secret, she rebelled against that command. She hid a small locket ring engraved with Anne's portrait close to her bosom, a silent pledge to her mother's memory. Modern psychologists suggest that this private act of rebellion was Elizabeth's way of preserving her last connection to maternal love, even as her public life demanded she erase it. They argue that the trauma of seeing her mother's execution and of being forced to condemn her planted the seeds of post-traumatic stress, forever linking the idea of marriage with terror and loss. By the time she was 8 years old, Elizabeth experienced another chilling spectacle. Henry, ever capricious in love, had taken Catherine Howard as his 5th wife. Catherine, a vivacious young woman, had enchanted the court with her youth and beauty. Yet Elizabeth knew too well that promises of devotion rapidly curdled into madness and death. The day came when Catherine, accused of infidelity, was dragged through the same echoing halls and led to the block. In Elizabeth's memory, Catherine's terrified eyes and the gleam of the sword became the second verse in a macabre lullaby, warning her that no woman could ever be safe in marriage to a king. When Elizabeth reached her 10th birthday, she had witnessed more marital carnage than most adults would endure in a lifetime. 5 wives in quick succession. Each one a promise of alliance, each one a tragedy retold. With every new royal nuptial, Henry's declarations of love dissolved like sugar in rain, giving way to betrayals more lethal than poison. To Elizabeth, marriage was neither sanctuary nor celebration. It was a charnel house where vows were drowned in blood. And yet, with each fresh horror, Henry remained determined to arrange a politically advantageous marriage for his daughter. Suitors were paraded before Elizabeth, their pedigrees recited, and alliances weighed. But Elizabeth, her young mind sharpened by sorrow and fear, remembered only this: to marry was to surrender her fate to someone else, perhaps even to the same grim destiny her mother and successive stepmothers had met. That bargain, she understood, was fatal. It meant signing away her autonomy to a man who had shown himself capable of ordering the death of those he had sworn to cherish. As a teenager, Elizabeth came to instinctively recoil whenever the subject of her own marriage was raised. She had seen how "I love you" could transform overnight into "off with your head." She sensed that, to her father, marriage was not a sacred union, but a tool of power, an instrument for controlling dynasties, rewarding loyalty, and discarding anyone no longer useful. Elizabeth resolved that her own status virgin queen would be her shield. Better to wear the crown alone than to risk the kind of intimacy that had cost her mother her life. Sleepy as it sounds, these traumas imprinted themselves like inscriptions on Elizabeth's soul. Every time she observed young ladies at court being matched with eligible bachelors, her chest tightened as though braced for a blade. Every mention of wedding bells sounded to her like the tolling of a funeral knell. And in the quiet hours before slumber, when the flicker of candlelight danced across tapestry and stone, Elizabeth would clutch her locket ring, feel the reassuring outline of her mother's image, and murmur a silent vow never to repeat the mistakes of the past. Thus, the first and darkest reason Elizabeth I refused to marry was the very man who should have been her protector. Henry VIII, in his quest for heirs and alliances, taught his daughter that marriage was a doorway to disaster. From Anne Boleyn's fall to Catherine Howard's demise, he orchestrated a nursery of nightmares. In choosing to remain unwed, Elizabeth was not being obstinate or overly patriotic. She was acting on the most basic instinct for survival. She wrapped herself in a mantle of virginity, a solitary shroud against a world that had shown her marriage only as agony and death. And from that fearful beginning arose the reign of one of history's most enigmatic and enduring monarchs, forever shaped by the horrors inflicted upon her by the father she once trusted. Reason 2. Betrayal by her stepfather and the crushing guilt. If the first reason that bound Elizabeth I to a life of solitude was the terror sown by her father, the second reason cut even deeper into her sense of self, and it came from her own household. At age 14, Elizabeth found herself at the centre of a harmless courtly game devised by her stepfather, Thomas Seymour. What Seymour and his wife, Catherine Parr, called playful teasing, was in truth a pattern of predatory intrusion that left Elizabeth feeling violated, confused, and irreparably stained by guilt. Imagine a teenager barely into her formative years, still clinging to the last vestiges of childhood innocence. Elizabeth's days had been filled with study, music lessons, and the cautious veneer of court etiquette. Yet late at night, when the candles burned low and the household grew still, Seymour would slip into her chamber, wearing his nightgown and slippers. Without warning, he would tickle her, pinch her sides, or tug at the hems of her gowns with a mischievous grin. Then, as though that weren't unsettling enough, he sometimes wielded a small knife, slashing at the fabric of her petticoat or gown, an implicit threat that sent chills through her young frame. To Seymour, these actions might have seemed like jest, the roughhousing between stepfather and stepdaughter, in an era when men of his station held considerable power over women and girls. But to Elizabeth, those midnight visits were fraught with peril. She never knew whether he would flirt, punish, or harm her next. In the flickering candlelight, her imagination conjured darker possibilities. What if he advanced beyond playful pinches? What if the knife was aimed at her rather than her garments? Each night, as her chamber grew cold, Elizabeth felt the walls closing in, and each dawn brought with it a weariness that no amount of royal comforts could assuage. The immediate fallout of Seymour's behaviour was not a swift punishment, but a slow, gnawing anxiety that something was profoundly wrong. Her governess charged with her protection was compelled to share Elizabeth's bedchamber, acting as a buffer between girl and stepfather. Yet these measures did little to soothe the storm raging within Elizabeth's thoughts. In the daytime, she walked the palace corridors with a stiff poise, betraying no hint of the turmoil that gripped her after nightfall. She mastered the art of the courtly smile, concealing the dread that awaited her after curfew. And then came the cruelest blow of all, when Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's stepmother, discovered Seymour's nightly visits. She did not shield her daughter from further harm. Instead, Parr blamed Elizabeth herself for Seymour's attentions, branding the girl as promiscuous and troublesome. In an astonishing act of cruelty, Parr declared that her stepdaughter had enticed the king's brother-in-law into improper behaviour. Elizabeth, mortified and terrified, suddenly believed that she bore responsibility for the very invasions of her privacy that had tormented her. If her own mother figure could accuse her of sin, then what power remained to dispute it? The humiliation of being shamed by her stepmother left Elizabeth feeling utterly isolated. She could not confide in her father, Henry VIII, who was often consumed by political machinations and the pursuit of yet another royal marriage. And she could not find solace in the ladies of the court, who whispered and averted their eyes as Elizabeth passed. The corridors that had once rung with her laughter now echoed with the faint sound of accusations that she had somehow invited her own disgrace. The climax of this dark chapter arrived when Seymour was arrested for treason. Among the charges levelled against him was an unseemly familiarity with the princess, an implication that Seymour had corrupted or seduced Elizabeth. Whether true or not, this allegation crucified Elizabeth's reputation. In a swift trial, Seymour was found guilty and condemned to death. The same blade that had taken Elizabeth's mother now fell on her stepfather. No one disputed the verdict. Seymour's own misdeeds, political and personal, had sealed his fate. Yet for Elizabeth, the sense of guilt was as sharp as any soldier's sword. In the months and years that followed, Elizabeth replayed those harrowing events in her mind, haunted by the notion that men who grew close to her brought ruin upon themselves. She wondered if her mere presence was a curse, a dark omen that spelled doom for any male who dared to cross the threshold of intimacy. How could she trust another heart when her own actions, perceived or real, had led to her stepfather's demise and her mother's earlier execution? More insidiously, the betrayal cut at her self-worth. If she was truly at fault for Seymour's advances, as Parr alleged, then she must be morally tainted. That feeling of inherent shame would follow Elizabeth into every court ceremony, every meeting of dignitaries, and every private council chamber discussion. No amount of royal protocol could wash away the stain she felt on her conscience. As a result, Elizabeth adopted an instinctive aversion to male companionship. She avoided situations that might lead to prolonged private conversation with a man, stepped back whenever a senator or courtier inched too close, and became rigidly formal during banquets or ceremonies. In the hush of her chambers, she would clutch at her locket containing her mother's portrait and whisper apologies for what she did not fully understand, but the weight of her imagined guilt demanded it. Over time, Elizabeth refined her defences. She surrounded herself with trusted ladies in waiting, chosen not for physical attractiveness, but for unwavering loyalty and discretion. She insisted that no man be alone with her, that all communications be conducted under the watchful eyes of female attendants. By weaving a web of strict boundaries, she created a fortress around her emotions, one that few could penetrate. Yet even behind that fortress, Elizabeth carried scars that no fortress could hide. Thus, the second reason Elizabeth refused to marry was born of a betrayal even darker than political intrigue, an intimate wound inflicted by the man who should have been her guardian. Thomas Seymour's actions and Catherine Parr's heartless blame seared into Elizabeth an unshakable belief that closeness invited catastrophe. She learned that to protect herself, she must keep every man at arm's length, and that any breach of that rule might unleash fresh horrors upon her life and legacy. It was a lesson as cruel as it was indelible, ensuring that the Virgin Queen would never again allow herself to be vulnerable to the tender and potentially deadly embrace of matrimony. Reason 3. Her body's deterioration and the fear of exposure. Reason 3 springs not from court intrigue or shattered loyalties, but from the very flesh of Elizabeth herself, an aspect so achingly human that it lurks beneath all the grand pageantry. As she entered her 30th year, the Queen's physical form had begun to betray her, and thoughts of marriage conjured not warmth or companionship, but the terror of having every flaw laid bare before a husband's gaze. By the time Elizabeth reached 30, sly whispers at court spoke of her deliberate avoidance of mirrors. In her private chambers, the purchase and upkeep of looking glasses were strictly forbidden without her express permission. Artists who attempted too faithful a likeness of her visage risked the royal displeasure, or worse. A single brushstroke that revealed the truth of her pockmarked skin or the sag of her neck could incur a harsh penalty. Thus, portrait painters were compelled to flatter, their canvases filled with luminescent veneers that hid the nagging flaws beneath her carefully arranged coif and rigid collar. Yet paint and canvas could do only so much. As she crossed into her 40th year, the Queen's teeth, once white and straight, had begun to decay into a mottled darkness. Many had fallen entirely, leaving voids that gave her smile the hollow look of ruined marble. To compensate, Elizabeth resorted to stuffing her cheeks with cloth, sculpting her mouth into an illusion of fullness. Courtiers claimed they needed to carry scented cloths at their nostrils to endure her proximity, such was the rankness of her breath. In whispered corridors, they spoke of the blackened jaws of the Virgin Queen, a grim irony for a monarch so famed for her radiance. But these dental afflictions were merely the start of her corporeal descent. Elizabeth's daily regimen included layers of white lead-based makeup, ground from toxic mineral and mixed with vinegar to create an alabaster mask. This concoction, while effective at hiding skin blemishes, was itself a slow poison. The lead seeped into her pores, cracking the flesh beneath and causing painful eruptions, scabs, and peeling skin. Yet Elizabeth daubed it on each morning and retouched it throughout the day, for without it she would have been unrecognizable to her subjects and vulnerable to scandal. In the year 1562, her fragility reached its apex when she contracted smallpox. She barely survived, but the disease left deep pox scars across her face and hands, each one a crater of memory. Following her recovery, she increased her reliance on the noxious white paste, hoping to smooth over the depressions with layer upon layer of lethal paint. Instead, the cracks multiplied, the texture of her skin resembling a shattered porcelain doll. Every crease and fissure was another betrayal by her own body. To Elizabeth, these afflictions were not mere cosmetic concerns, they were existential threats. In her mind, any spouse would see through the layers of artifice and recoil at the reality beneath. A marriage bed would be the ultimate exposure. Her hidden wounds, dental horrors, and contaminated skin laid bare in the intimate darkness. The image of queenly purity she had cultivated, the Virgin Queen, depended entirely upon the illusion of perfection. Marriage, in contrast, promised a stripping away of that illusion, a forced unveiling before a husband's intimate scrutiny. She understood that her carefully constructed persona would crumble at the slightest touch. The gowns, jewels, and controlled court ceremonies could only armor her so much. In private, behind the heavy silken drapes of her bedchamber, there was no place for pretense. The flicker of candlelight would reveal the uneven texture of her skin, the thin spaces where teeth had rotted away, and the outline of cloth packing her cheeks. A husband raised to share her bed would require her whole story, every scar and flaw laid out like a royal account, impossible to redact. Thus, Elizabeth clung to her sovereignty and her solitude as twin shields. Whereas other queens might use marriage to secure alliances, she viewed the wedding chamber as a perilous trap. She reasoned that the crown she wore on her head was less burdensome than the crown she might have to discard upon realizing her body's betrayals. To submit to a husband, and to the intimacy it would entail, meant risking utter humiliation or worse. The humility of a shared bed, she knew, could unmake her public grandeur in an instant. Every morning's application of paint, every enforced refusal of personal likeness, and every dental remedy was a small act of desperation, a way to postpone the inevitable unmasking that marriage would demand. She encased herself in layers of artifice, powder to gloss over disfigurements, cloth to reshape her jaw, dresses so stiff and high-collared that no one could glimpse the swan-like curve of her neck. Each barrier reinforced her resolve never to wed, for in marriage, those barriers would fall like dominoes, each toppling to reveal another private calamity. And so, in the hush between night and dawn, Elizabeth's thoughts turned to the cost of exposure. The fear of a husband's eyes gliding over her body, discovering each carefully hidden flaw, was more terrifying than any battlefield or political conspiracy. While others might dream of companionship or heirs, Elizabeth only saw in matrimony a dark mirror, reflecting her deepest vulnerabilities. In that mirror, she chose not to see herself as a bride, but as a monarch poised on a precipice. She understood the stakes. To marry was to risk everything she had built, every fragment of authority she wielded, against the jagged edge of her own mortality. And so, once again, she chose solitude, and the crown alone, trading the warmth of a shared bed for the bitter comfort of absolute control. For Elizabeth I, in her most private moments, the greatest horror of all was the thought of having to unveil the true face she had spent a lifetime masking. Reason 4. The curse of the men around her. Imagine a shadow trailing every man who dared to draw near Elizabeth I, as though proximity to her person carried nothing but doom. This grim pattern unfolds most famously in her bond with Robert Dudley, her childhood companion, and perhaps the deepest affection of her life. Though Dudley was already married when Elizabeth ascended the throne, she kept him near at court, promoting him to positions of influence and elevating his status above that of many dukes and earls. To the outside world, their closeness seemed innocent enough, a queen trusting a lifelong friend, yet behind closed doors rumour whispered of an attachment far more intimate, a love that both enchanted and terrified those who observed it. Then came the catastrophe. Amy Robsart, Dudley's wife, was discovered at the bottom of a staircase with her neck broken. It was no simple misfortune. The circumstances were suspicious. The door to her lodging was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of a struggle. Court gossip exploded overnight. Many believed Elizabeth harboured secrets she would never confess, that she had desired Dudley's freedom so fiercely she had looked the other way as fate took its course. Others posited that Dudley himself orchestrated the fall. When the widowed Dudley returned to court, offered Elizabeth the chance to wed, she recoiled. The spectre of tragedy clung to any notion of their union, as if marriage itself would repeat the horrors of Amy's demise. Instead of embarking on the long-promised nuptials, Elizabeth stepped back, and Dudley remained her close counsellor and favourite, yet never her husband. In that choice, both of them were bound. She retained her crown, and he, his life though stripped of the marriage he had yearned for, clung to her side until his final days. Dudley was only the first in an unending procession of doomed admirers. Christopher Hatton, a stalwart courtier famed for his loyalty, poured wealth and creativity into pleasing the Queen. He built magnificent houses for her visits, staged elaborate entertainments, and dedicated his fortunes to securing her favour. Yet Elizabeth, mindful of past calamities, extended only polite tokens of gratitude. Hatton's heart, starved of full reward, withered as the years went by. Physicians declared his final decline a matter of melancholy, a sickness of spirit. They called it best described today as a broken heart. Hatton's death only hardened Elizabeth's conviction that emotional intimacy, even unconsummated, carried its own peril. Behind these tragedies lay the same stark lesson. To come to love Elizabeth was to court destruction. Maybe it was the ghost of Anne Boleyn's blade lurking in every wedge of silence, or the terror of her stepfather's betrayal echoing in every whisper of desire. Whatever the cause, the Queen's personal history cast a malignant aura over her relationships. Any man who dared hope for more than her friendship risked disaster, be it scandalous rumours, sudden illness, or an untimely demise. By middle age, Elizabeth had become a figure as much of worship as of wary fear. Courtiers vied for her attention, eager to prove themselves indispensable, yet none dared press too far. They had witnessed the fates of Dudley and Hatton, understood that desire paired with the Queen's intransigence could be lethal, so they danced around her, offering praise and counsel, holding back the confessions of the heart. Their whispered devotion filled the palace, a hush of longing that ebbed away when confronted with Elizabeth's frosty composure. This chilling pattern reinforced Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarriageable. She saw that marriage was not merely a political alliance, but a potential death sentence for both parties. The broken bodies and spirits of her closest companions stood as stark reminders that she could never trust love to flourish safely in her presence. A husband would not only challenge her sovereignty, but also suffer for loving her. She would never again flirt with the possibility of matrimonial union, knowing that it would condemn her chosen partner to ruin. And so, Elizabeth's solitude became her fortress. Within it, she wielded her authority unshared, safeguarded by the very curse that haunted her suitors. She held court amid gilded splendour, but permitted no man to join her at her side in the bond of marriage. Her solitary reign, though resplendent to her subjects, was the lonely refuge of a woman convinced that intimacy equalled peril. Even as her legend grew, casting her as the virgin queen unwavering in devotion to her nation, the truth lay buried beneath the pageantry, that she chose solitude out of survival, shielded by an aura of sorrow and dread, and bound by the tragic fates of those who had dared to love her. Thus, the fourth and perhaps most sorrowful reason Elizabeth I refused to marry was the curse she seemed to carry, an unbreakable chain of calamity that struck down every man who ventured too close. Love, even in its gentlest form, proved to be an instrument of death. In keeping all suitors at a distance, Elizabeth preserved her life, her crown, and her identity, but she also surrendered the possibility of companionship. She reigned alone, sustained by the knowledge that intimacy was too high a price for survival in the lonely world she had inherited. Reason 5. Her obsession with power and absolute control. Reason 5 lies at the heart of Elizabeth I's reign. Her relentless obsession with holding absolute power, an obsession that eclipsed every other impulse, even the most human desire for companionship. Throughout her 45-year rule, Elizabeth was not merely the head of state. She was the centre of a carefully orchestrated courtly universe in which every movement revolved around her singular authority. From the granting of offices to the bestowal of honours, from the colours of the gowns worn by her ladies-in-waiting to the precise protocols for greeting foreign ambassadors, every detail required her approval. Each banquet, each pageant, each private audience was staged like a performance in which she played the sole starring role. To those who longed for favour, for a title, or simply for the privilege of sharing her company, the message was clear. It was better to be in Elizabeth's grace than to risk her wrath. In her view, marriage would be a step across a threshold she could never allow herself to pass, because a husband, no matter how loyal, would immediately gain legal rights, social standing, and influence that could rival or even rival her own. A husband might claim the title of king consort, wield a measure of authority in state affairs, and sit beside her at council meetings. Such an arrangement was inconceivable to someone who had forged her identity on being the unchallenged sovereign. The very thought of having to share that stage, to bow to another's presence at her side, filled her with a dread deeper than any battlefield or political alliance. Elizabeth's mastery of control extended beyond mere decrees. She dictated the exact cut and colour of her courtiers' clothing, forbade unsanctioned private meetings, and even planted spies among her ladies to monitor their conversations and romantic liaisons. If any gentleman or gentlewoman dared to marry without her explicit permission, they could find themselves stripped of titles, removed from court, or even imprisoned. Such measures were not only punitive, but also preventative, designed to maintain a system of utter dependence on her will. She was, in effect, the sole arbiter of life and death for every soul within her sphere, ensuring that loyalty to her remained paramount. This obsession with control transformed her celibacy into a political weapon. Elizabeth would tease the idea of marriage, allowing suitors and counsellors to hope that they might win her hand, only to snatch that hope away at the last moment. Those who believed they were on the brink of marriage often found themselves nursing bitter disappointment when Elizabeth withdrew her promise with a cold smile. In a court culture driven by patronage and favour, such broken promises were painful indeed. Long after the rumours of her imminent wedding faded, many remained haunted by the belief that they had been tantalised only to be cast aside. Heartbreak, resentment, and even physical illness followed another demonstration that loving Elizabeth, even from afar, came with a perilous price. Indeed, some courtiers are said to have suffered declining health, insomnia, and depression after Elizabeth rescinded her word. The scandal of unfulfilled promise undercut their standing, deprived them of expected rewards, and signalled to the wider court that no one dared assume a place at her side. Elizabeth understood that by controlling the hopes and ambitions of her nobles, she could keep them in a constant state of competition for her favour, ensuring that their energies were spent in service and intrigue rather than in factional plotting. She maintained her solitary throne, not from indifference but from strategic calculation. Solitude reinforced her mystique and prevented any rival power centre from emerging in the form of a consort. The result was a reign in which the Virgin Queen became an emblem of untouchable authority. She was adored for her intellect, her patronage of the arts, and her political acumen, but she was also feared for her temper, her swift retribution, and her capacity to crush any hint of insubordination. When Elizabeth's courtiers contemplated love or marriage, they did so with caution, aware that any misstep could provoke her fury. Some whispered that her legendary outbursts, hurling objects, banishing favourites, or threatening imprisonment, were as much a demonstration of her absolute sovereignty as her royal proclamations. Yet, for all its drama, Elizabeth's control served a deeper purpose. She had experienced trauma and betrayal at every turn, from her father's brutality to her stepfather's predations, and she had watched lovers and confidants fall into despair and death. To her, power was the one thing she could hold without fear of loss. It was a fortress built from her past suffering, a barrier that protected her not only from political rivals but from the vulnerability inherent in marriage and affection. By refusing to share that fortress, she preserved her autonomy and shielded herself from further betrayal. In the twilight of her reign, Elizabeth's court was a theatre of dependency, every noble actor enacting their part to win her smile, to earn a favour, to glimpse her hand. And yet the curtain never rose on the final act of marriage. Even as the years advanced and the Queen's features became more lined, the promise of a consort remained perpetually deferred. Elizabeth wielded that promise like a blade sharp enough to draw hope, yet never blunt enough to bind her to another. Ultimately, Elizabeth I's relentless drive for absolute control was the final decisive reason she remained unmarried. It was not piety or patriotic sacrifice that set her apart. but a finely honed strategy born of trauma and shaped by experience. She had seen the dangers of power shared with a spouse, and concluded that her crown was safest upon her solitary head. In an era when queens were expected to wed for alliances, she defied convention, forging a new paradigm in which a sovereign woman could rule alone. But that solitary throne came at the cost of intimacy and vulnerability. As the final curtain fell on her life, she was still the virgin queen, unmarried, absolute, and forever bearing the weight of her own unyielding will. The mock marriage rule and her courtly retention tactics. Having delineated the 5 horrifying reasons that bound Elizabeth to solitude, we now turn to the ingenious and chilling ways she wielded the mere prospect of marriage as a tool to secure unwavering loyalty among her courtiers. In Elizabeth's world, the promise of wedlock was never an actual promise, but a carefully calibrated mirage, deployed whenever she wished to remind her nobles of their dependence on her favour. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth mastered the art of suggestion without commitment. At strategic moments, whispers would ripple through the palace. "Did you hear that the Queen is considering Lord A as her husband?" Or, "They say the French match is back on the table." These rumours were never officially confirmed, indeed. The Queen herself would allow such stories to bloom and wither without comment, but they served their purpose. Each time Elizabeth appeared in public alongside a man rumoured to be her intended, the entire court would erupt into feverish speculation. The councillors would redouble their flattery, the ambassadors would press their advantages, and the ladies-in-waiting would jostle for positions closest to the rumoured bridegroom. Yet, just as anticipation reached its peak, Elizabeth would abruptly withdraw any hint of consent. In a telling example, when talk of a Spanish prince's suit reached a crescendo, courtiers prepared lavish gowns, planned alliances for their families, and even commissioned poets to compose verses celebrating the coming union. Then, with a single curt announcement or sometimes no announcement at all, Elizabeth left them waiting. No negotiations proceeded, no letters were exchanged, and the prince's emissaries departed, clutching their unused gifts. The courtiers, once so eager, were left to nurse their wounded hopes in the quiet of their chambers. This pattern of betrothal and retraction performed several key functions. First, it kept her nobles in a perpetual state of striving, never certain whether they might secure the ultimate prize of proximity to the Queen's person. Second, it reinforced the notion that Elizabeth and Elizabeth alone held the power of life and death over their fortunes and reputations. By dangling the possibility of marriage before them, she demonstrated that their entire livelihood could be altered at her whim. No noble could feel secure in his station, for on a queen who could banish a duke overnight, the promise of wedlock served as both carrot and stick. The psychological impact of this tactic cannot be overstated. Courtiers learned to temper ambition with deference, to mask disappointment with loyalty, and to avoid any frank talk of marriage. Should a courtier dare to speak too forthrightly, "My lady, I await your hand in marriage with unwavering devotion," he risked immediate censure. Elizabeth's response might be an icy glare, the withdrawal of a customary gift, or in extreme cases, removal from her presence altogether. The message was unambiguous. To presume upon her personal life was to invite swift and punishing rebuke. In effect, Elizabeth transformed marriage into an illusion, a drawn-out theatrical performance without a final act. Her intended suitors and suspected favourites became players on her courtly stage, each striving to win applause for roles they would never actually inhabit. The court itself resembled a grand melodrama, where every movement, every nod, and every regard was scrutinized for its possible marital subtext. The result was a court consumed by cautious ambition, its members policing their own behavior lest they appear too eager or too indignant at rejection. By maintaining this perpetual tease, Elizabeth also prevented any single nobleman from consolidating power through marriage. In many European courts, the king's consort might garner her own power base through patronage, familial connections, or foreign alliances, and threaten the monarch's preeminence. Elizabeth, having witnessed how dangerous a husband could be, would brook no such risk. Instead, she ensured that no man ever gained sufficient intimate access to challenge her. She remained the sole sovereign in both name and reality. Moreover, this strategy fostered a unique form of camaraderie among her courtiers. They were united in their shared experience of uncertainty and longing. Rival factions, which might have otherwise fractured the government, found common cause in vying harmoniously for Elizabeth's elusive hand. Their energy, rather than channeled into rebellion or intrigue, was funneled into public displays of loyalty, gifts of poetry, lavish entertainments, and deferential gestures that enriched Elizabeth's courtly spectacle. In this way, the mock marriages served her political ends by aligning competitive impulses toward harmonious devotion. Of course, this was not without its casualties. Some courtiers fell into depression or desperation, their hopes dashed too many times to count. A few even lingered too long in public displays of romantic grief, only to be admonished or removed from court. Their misfortunes served as examples, cautionary tales about the dangers of overstepping the bounds of royal favour. And yet, the cycle continued: rumours, preparations, public appearances, and abrupt cancellations like a pendulum swinging between hope and despair, all orchestrated by Elizabeth's will. Thus, Elizabeth's mock marriage rule became her sharpest psychological weapon. By controlling the hearts of her courtiers, she ensured that they remained pliant and dependent. They were forever chasing a phantom wedding, eager for an opportunity to secure favour that never truly materialised. That desire kept them loyal, disciplined, and afraid to stray into disloyalty. In Elizabeth's hands, the concept of marriage became a perpetual instrument of power, a symbol of her unmatched ability to command not only the realm, but the very emotions of those who served her. And in that sustained control lay the true genius of her solitary triumph. A queen who ruled without a consort, yet held the entire court in thrall to the faintest whisper of a wedding that would never come. A bittersweet legacy, an empire forged from personal wounds. From year to year, Elizabeth I transmuted her personal traumas into the tools of her sovereignty. The tales of her childhood horrors, stepfather's betrayals, the ravaged condition of her own body, the curse upon her lovers, and her unrelenting obsession with control coalesced into a portrait of a queen far removed from the romantic legends of yore. She was no longer the gentle, magnanimous mother of the realm, but a merciless strategist, a sovereign who harnessed fear itself to construct and maintain her empire. At the heart of Elizabeth's governance lay a pervasive atmosphere of vigilance and restraint. Her policies in diplomacy were calculated to exploit rivals' uncertainties, encouraging alliances one moment, stoking rival fears the next, so that foreign powers never felt entirely secure. In matters of war, she commissioned fleets and armies, not only to defend England, but also to remind her subjects and enemies alike that she wielded the power of life and death with cool detachment. Each decision in domestic affairs, whether granting a patent to a merchant or appointing a county sheriff, was weighed for its capacity to reinforce her authority, to remind every official that their fortunes rose or fell at her pleasure. But more than land or sea power, Elizabeth's true strength lay in her mastery of psychological manipulation. She controlled the emotions of her courtiers as one might command the tides. By sowing seeds of doubt among potential rivals, she ensured that they focused less on plotting rebellion and more on securing her favour. The phantom of mock marriages served as yet another instrument, an ever-present reminder that no noble dared presume upon her goodwill. Those who had felt the sting of her broken promises seldom ventured to challenge her openly. They learned that loyalty often feigned was the safest course for survival. Under this regime of calculated intimidation, even the most ambitious courtiers accepted subservience as inevitable. They preferred to cling to the slender hope of a favour rather than risk the ruin that came with disobedience. A single misstep, too frank a remark, too bold a request could result in sudden disgrace, exile from court, or worse, imprisonment in the Tower. Thus, Elizabeth fashioned a court that, beneath its sumptuous veneer, pulsed with the quiet throb of fear. Her legacy, then, was an empire shaped and sustained by her personal suffering. A girl who had witnessed her mother's execution, endured her stepfather's depredations, and suffered the ravages of disease and poison, had learned that power and security were inseparable. Elizabeth demonstrated that authority springs not only from a scepter, but from the ability to manipulate doubts, to fracture loyalties, and to maintain a pervasive sense of dependence. Hers was an absolutism of the mind, a rule that commandeered not just territory and soldiers, but the very thoughts and emotions of those around her. It is this fusion of ruthlessness and psychological acuity that makes Elizabeth unique in the annals of history. She was venerated as a patron of the arts, a defender of the realm, and an icon of Protestant resistance. yet simultaneously dreaded for her mercurial temper and her capacity to crush any perceived threat. To her subjects, she was both mother and overlord. To foreign envoys, she was an enigma, a queen who could feign matrimonial interest one day and banish a duke the next. Ultimately, Elizabeth's reign stands as a testament to the brutal efficacy of fear as a governing principle. She wielded her own traumas like a blade, carving out a realm in which no potential rival could ever approach the heights she occupied without risking ruin. The Virgin Queen's sovereignty was built upon a foundation of shadows. Shadows cast by her father's blade, her stepfather's intrusions, her own physical decay, the ruin of her lovers, and her unquenchable thirst for unfettered power. In the quiet of her chambers, as candlelight flickered across tapestries and the echoes of courtly music drifted down the corridors, Elizabeth may have sensed the weight of her choices. She had chosen solitude over companionship, sovereignty over partnership, and fear over affection. But from that sacrifice sprang an empire unmatched in its combination of stability and spectacle, authority and artifice. Thus, Elizabeth I emerges not as the romantic heroine of children's tales, but as a figure of profound complexity, a monarch who turned her own anguish into an unassailable realm. Her reign was a dark mirror, reflecting both the dangers of uncontrolled power and the astonishing resilience of a woman determined to survive at any cost. And in that reflection lies her most enduring legacy. A kingdom forged from the fire of personal pain, ruled by a queen who mastered the greatest weapon of all the human heart and mind. Through these 5 dark reasons, the portrait of Elizabeth I emerges not as the famed Virgin Queen of legend, but as a woman haunted by her past, one who transformed pain into power and wielded authority as a shield against vulnerability. From her father's psychological torture to her stepfather's betrayal, from the ravages inflicted on her body to the curse of every man who dared to love her, and finally to her obsession with absolute control, Elizabeth wove a tapestry of harsh lessons. Marriage was peril, intimacy, a seed of destruction, and power something to be held alone. She did not choose a solitary life out of patriotism. She did so for her own survival, not only to protect her physical being from exposure, but also to safeguard her authority from collapse. Elizabeth mastered the political game by running her court like a carefully staged theatre, in which everyone, actors and onlookers alike, were bound by their own interests and their fear of her. She understood that a sovereign who shares her power risks undoing the very foundations of her rule. This Queen of Darkness was both feared and fascinating. She became the symbol of authority distilled from a wounded soul, where every political decision bore shards of her personal trauma. Her reign demonstrated that supreme power is sometimes built upon deepest suffering. Beneath her regal demeanor lay the echo of a child forced to betray her mother, the memory of sting and fear in a stepfather's chamber, the ache of decaying flesh hidden behind poisoned cosmetics, the ominous warning in every lover's tragic end, and the ironclad conviction that sharing power would mean relinquishing control and perhaps life itself. When we look back on Elizabeth's reign, we cannot separate history from psychology. Each chapter of the English Empire during her era carries the imprint of a woman who ruled not only by law, but by the precise manipulation of fear. The fear of marriage, the fear of exposure, the fear of betrayal, and the fear of losing control. Her personal horrors became the instruments of her impervious rule. In her earliest days, trauma stalked her in the guise of a father's betrayal and a mother's execution. That childhood lesson told her that to wed was to risk death. Later, a stepfather's midnight intrusions taught her that intimacy could be a trap baited with guilt. As she matured, her body, once an emblem of youth and vitality, became a ruin, requiring dangerous concealment. Those who cared for her spiritually or politically found their lives cut short or broken, teaching her that affection itself could be lethal. And through it all, she forged a steely resolve to hold the reins of power alone. Yet even as her people cheered her triumphs against foreign fleets and domestic plots, they sensed in her court a peculiar tension. A queen who loomed larger than life, yet kept them always at arm's length. In the hush of private audiences, courtiers caught glimpses of the vulnerability she never allowed to surface in public. They saw a flicker of weariness in her eyes as she applied yet another layer of powder, a flash of sorrow as she listened to tales of woe from her counselors, and the faintest tremor of regret when discussing alliances she had manipulated but never consummated. Elizabeth's empire thus became a monument to self-preservation writ large. She proved that a monarch could be both admired and dreaded, loved and reviled, venerated for her strength and pitied for her solitude. The Virgin Queen's legacy is a testament to the fact that leadership forged in suffering can achieve astonishing durability, yet it also exacts a profound personal toll. In her final years, as her health waned and her court grew anxious, Elizabeth's power remained unchallenged, anchored in the indomitable will she had honed over decades of hardship. Ultimately, Elizabeth I's reign reminds us that history and the human psyche are inseparable. A sovereign's motives and methods are shaped by her innermost wounds as much as by political necessity. In Elizabeth's case, every state act, every alliance, every execution, every court intrigue was drawn in the shadow of her own trauma. She turned her personal nightmares into the wheels of statecraft, crafting a rule both magnificent and merciless. And so, when we recall the era of Elizabeth I, let us remember the dual nature of her power. It was a power derived from wisdom and courage, but also from fear and pain. She taught us that the greatest weapon a ruler can wield is not the sword or the law, but the capacity to command hearts and minds, to instill such profound awe and terror that her authority became unassailable. In that alchemy of fear-forged power lies the true, haunting legacy of the Queen of England, an empire built upon the bedrock of a woman's unhealed wounds, yet shining in triumph as long as she lived. Now, as our journey through the shadows of Queen Elizabeth's life comes to a close, allow yourself to drift with the gentle cadence of history's final breath. Imagine the torches in the hallways growing dim, their flames flickering like fleeting memories. In this hush, let the echoes of the past soften into a distant lullaby. We began with the blade that severed a mother's life, and ended with a throne built upon unspoken fears. Along the way, we have wandered through corridors of power, where every gesture was weighed, every promise measured, and every heart held hostage by the spectre of trust betrayed. We saw a child forced to renounce her own blood, a teenager haunted by secret intrusions, a queen hiding behind layers of poison and paint, lovers undone by circumstance, and subjects forever dancing on the tightrope of her favor. Yet beneath all this weight lay a simple, human truth, that when trauma goes unhealed, it can shape destinies far greater than any battlefield or council chamber. Elizabeth I taught us that power born of pain can be paradoxically strong and fragile, that a ruler can command fleets and armies, yet tremble at the thought of laying her head upon another's shoulder. And now, in this twilight moment, let us release that tension. Breathe in slowly, hold, and exhale. Feel the tension of courtly intrigue and royal command slip away, like petals falling from an autumn rose. Picture the heavy velvet drapes drawn closed, sealing the world of politics and pretense behind a soft barrier. Let the hush of candlelight soothe your senses, and allow your eyelids to grow heavy as you contemplate the lessons of a life lived in extremes. What, then, is the message we carry from this tale? Perhaps it is that the most formidable walls we build around ourselves, even those meant to protect, can also imprison. Or that true strength may lie not in the unyielding grip of power, but in the courage to face our own vulnerabilities and to seek connection beyond fear. Elizabeth's reign reminds us that empathy and understanding, genuine, unguarded empathy, are the truest hallmarks of leadership, far more enduring than any crown. As the final embers of our story fade, know that history's darkest chapters need not leave us in darkness. Instead, they can guide us toward compassion, reminding us to nurture the bonds of trust and openness in our own lives. Let this be a quiet benediction, that even the most wounded hearts can find healing, and that the shield of power may one day be laid down in favor of kindness. Now, feel the softening of the chambers of your mind, the slow descent of your consciousness into a peaceful slumber. May your dreams be gentle, free from the echoes of swords and courtly whispers. May you rest in the knowledge that every story, no matter how harrowing, can lead us home to understanding, to empathy, and to the quiet strength of the human spirit. Sleep well, dear listener, and when you awaken, may you carry with you the wisdom found in these shadows. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and join us for more stories that illuminate the hidden corners of history. Good night, and may your dreams be as serene as a candle's last flicker. Good night.